All right, for today's Jolly Lark, we are going to be painting up a Caradron Overlord's Thunderer. Started with a Pro-Acryl mint green spray on top of a black undercoat. And then what we're going to do is use a pre-mixed blend of Citadel Contrast Medium and Pro-Acryl Transparent Green. Using a nice big fat brush, what we're going to do is just try to get an even coat all over the miniature. What we're doing here is kind of brushing it on without too much paint on the brush. You want to get a thin, even coat all over everything. It'll naturally settle into the recesses, but what you don't want is any sort of blobs or pools. You can see as we've sped up the time here that kind of just getting it all over, nice thin coat. We're not worrying about what's going to eventually be green yet at this point or not. And adding that transparent layer over a light color really gives you a vibrancy that I think is hard to achieve with any single color of paint. It's not doing a lot to shade the miniature at this point. The shading will come in later, but it's getting a little bit of detail in the recesses, especially around the cracks and the rivets and stuff like that. But the fine shading and the broad stroke shading, we're actually going to paint in later. It'll give us a nice vibrant effect when it's all said and done. I get a lot of questions about basing. How'd you do that base? And so I thought I'd leave some of the basing details in here, even though it's not directly related to the green armor. Using the Vallejo thick mud paste, it's not that expensive for a big tub of it. I like using bamboo skewers to apply it and just kind of a gentle rolling action. And you want to do this after the miniature is primed, so that you get a good stick to the mud to the base. While the mud is still wet, just kind of give the sides of the base a scrape. Sometimes the skewer isn't enough if you were a little bit messy, but don't be afraid to just grab your finger and give the side a quick swipe to remove any excess basing material. Let that dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. Having painted the whole miniature with the mint green and then the transparent green wash glaze, we're now going to go in and base coat everything. At this stage, anything that's not going to be green needs its base coat. Now these miniatures are largely green, and we're just going to go in and put some red accents in. Again, we're going to go back and shade the entire miniature all at one time. So it's important to have everything be base coated. I really like the Pro-Acryl paints for doing stuff like this because they have a thin enough consistency that they flow pretty well straight out of the bottle, and while still providing pretty good coverage even with stuff like reds. And then you get a little bit better coverage when you're going over a light base coat. This color scheme looks really striking on the table. You can check out the Jolly Lark Instagram page for more pictures of the finished project. We've got some of the big boats and some other squads pictures posted up on there. This bright green and red color scheme was inspired by some very cool kind of retro futuristic 1950s, 1960s toy tanks that have a similar kind of light green and red color scheme. At one point I was a little worried that this bright green color scheme looked a little too ghosty, but I think it's okay. I particularly like it on the big boats. So we're moving on here to paint some of the metallics. We're now going in with the Pro-Acryl White Gold. Now it's called White Gold, but this has actually become my go-to color for base coating metals. You can see here that it's basically, when it goes on, it's like a silvery color with some warm undertones that I actually think works pretty well as a base coat for any white metals like steel or something like that. You can really change the color of it by what wash you put on top. This with a gray or a black wash on it makes a really nice steel. put a seraphim sepia or some sort of more golden wash on it, and you're going to get something that looks a little bit more brassy. It also makes a great highlight color for any reddish metallics. I particularly like it with the Pro-Acryl Copper. And what we're going to start doing with Jolly Lark videos is putting the little 3x stamp on the upper right, as you can see here, whenever we've sped up the video speed. Now, I like to see all the different steps to a painting video, but watching it real time is a little slower than it needs to be. So just know that whenever you see that 3x icon, it's not that I've drank a bunch of coffee and my hands are speeding up, but it's a consistent 3x multiplier. So for the next step, we're going to paint in the shadows. We're using a mixture of the Contrast Basilicanum Gray on the left. We've got Citadel's Contrast Medium in the middle, and some of Vallejo's Black Glaze on the right. The Black Glaze is a really interesting paint. It's got a thick, almost gel-like consistency, but it's also very transparent. So you can see that's undiluted. It's a thick, transparent black. And I actually like that gel consistency a lot. It makes it easy to kind of smoosh it into the corners of the miniature to get some nice, deep, dark shadows. So often what I'll do when I'm painting in the shadows on a miniature is start with a fairly dilute, probably like 4:1 or 3:1 contrast medium to the Basilicanum Gray. And I'm coming into the miniature and just painting in the undersides of the different surfaces. If you want to get a sense of which surfaces ought to be shaded, you can almost just look at the miniature upside down. Anything that you can see from the bottom maybe should be in shadow. Anything you can see by looking at the miniature from the top down probably shouldn't be, unless it's something that's falling under something else. You generally want a miniature to be a little lighter on the top than at the bottom, so sometimes I'll give some shading to the feet, even though they're a top surface. And one thing that you achieve by painting in the shadows selectively versus doing an all-over wash is you are able to place the shadows where they ought to be. If you were to go through and hit this entire miniature with a bath of Nuln Oil, apologies for wandering off frame here, but do my best to stay centered, but it is challenging. But yeah, if you were to hit this miniature with a bath of Nuln Oil, you just really hit the entire thing with Nuln Oil, it does a great job of bringing out the contrast and settling into the lines between colors, but it's also going to dull everything a little. You're adding, when you hit a whole miniature with a quick shade or a Nuln Oil or an Agrax Earth shade, you're applying that color to everything, which makes it challenging to keep the vibrancy of the upper colors. By painting into the shadows to the cracks and the crevices, it just gives you a lot more control about what areas you want to be darker. So here, I'm getting some of the darker Basilicanum Gray into the underside of his helmet, into the cracks around his head, the areas where surfaces are meeting, putting in some of that shading in between the backpack and the torso, underneath the arms, bottom of the backpack. Kind of imagine anywhere where a shadow would be cast. And you'll see also I'm doing this over the entire miniature, which is why it was important to go in and add in the copper, the dark green on the pants, the silver, and the reds before doing this step. What this lets you do is you're essentially shading the entire miniature with one color, and the contrast paints are great for that. Because they're translucent, you're still seeing the color that was underneath through the original color. It's almost like you're looking through a tinted window at the color behind. The trick is then it just lets you tint the areas that you want to tint. And when I'm doing this step, I usually turn my ceiling fan on to medium or even high, because I want to be putting on thin layers. You can see I'm going over some areas over and over again to build up a little bit darker or more gradual shadows, and we'll slow this down in just a second and show you the finished effect. But I think this, in my experience, this is a much, much faster than individually shading every single color. You go back in with some pure Basilicanum to tint the metal areas and pick out those finest details. Darken anything you want to darken. Sometimes we'll paint a little shadow on the base at the end, like to the actual shadow of the model itself. And we'll show a finished picture of the miniature again at the end of the video. But you can see here that really those painting the shadows kind of gives the whole thing a nice naturalistic pop. It's not exactly the heavy metal traditional style, but I prefer the effect of having the shadows overpainted on top of the base colors. And then after this, we'll go back in and add a final layer of highlights. So for the armor's highlights, we're going to be using some of the Warcolours glazing medium. You could use any clear medium mixed with the original, the bright pale green Pro-Acryl color that was airbrushed onto the miniature to begin with. So that's going to be our main highlight color, is just to go back in and highlight with the same color that you used to airbrush the miniature. So this is exactly the same color that was sprayed onto the miniature to start with before we added the transparent green wash. So adding that back in as a highlight layer now means that it blends in well. It matches perfectly the greens, and the areas that were glazed with the transparent green first now become a shade. And something about this I feel like gives a very natural look to the highlights and shadows. And some areas I'm just picking up, kind of doing this kind of fast and loose. These are gaming miniatures. I'm not painting for competition. You'll hear me say that over and over in these videos. I did some competition painting back in the day, but those spending months on one miniature is not my hobby now. So these are very much gaming miniatures. You're trying to achieve an impressionistic effect of light and shadow in a reasonably efficient amount of time. Start to finish, this miniature probably took about an hour to do, with all the details. And the Caradron miniatures aren't too bad because they don't have a lot of skin, they don't have any eyes to paint. It's relatively easy to paint these reasonably quickly, even with as much detail as they have on it, because so much of the detail can be the same color and you can knock that out in the same steps. So here I'm just going in with some of that pure bright pale green from Pro-Acryl, picking out some of it's kind of a combination of panel lines and some kind of smudgy shading on the raised surfaces. And you'll notice here that I'm basically only highlighting surfaces that can be seen from above. I want to create that sense of contrast. The shadows got put in below, the highlights get put on top, and we'll speed it up here as we're basically doing the same thing across the miniature. We're just hitting the raised areas again with a little bit of the pure bright minty green that was airbrushed onto the miniature as its base coat. And you'll notice in the beginning for this highlight step, I also gave myself a few drops of the Pro-Acryl Bright Ivory. That'll be used for some teeny tiny highlights, some very, very small highlights. That is not an overall everywhere highlight color, but I'm going to grab some of that bright ivory at the end and make the uppermost highest points of the model pop just a little bit more. If I was doing this same sort of color on a more natural surface, like cloth, or if I was trying to do, ghostly skin or something like that, I would probably skip the bright ivory stage, because I think that extreme of a highlight gives it a little bit more of a mechanical, glossy effect. So now you can see that the miniature is really coming in to its own. The glazed areas have become the shades. We've gone back in with that base coat and finished the bright pale green. And now you can see I'm just putting on a little bit of that bright ivory onto some of the highest, brightest areas. If you've watched any videos on painting non-metallic metals, which is, I don't prefer for actual metals, but I think that you can get some nice highlighting tips from the non-metallic metal techniques when painting any sort of machined glossy surfaces about where you're going to get those brightest kind of specular highlights. What are the little corners and lines where an imagined light source is going to reflect and catch? You're kind of adding a little bit of sparkle to the miniature at the very end. And this just kind of helps define the spaces and shapes. You'll notice I'm paying a little extra attention to the helmet to highlight the bridge of the nose, some of the lines of the face, top of the backpack, top of the gun, and that's it. So final step, a little bit of a Tamiya sanding pad. I use the 600 grit, again, just kind of showing some of the basing. I usually go over the edges of the base. By the time I'm done with a miniature, I've almost inevitably mucked up the edges of the base a little bit, so I'm just going to give them a quick sand to smooth them out so that the edge color can go on smoothly. And just load up a brush. I always, for my edges of my bases, I use whatever the darkest color, the darkest base color for the texture was. In this case, it's the Pro-Acryl Dark Purple. And that's it. The miniature is pretty well finished up. We've skipped some of the painting details to focus on the armor, but you can take a look at the Instagram page to check out pictures of the completed squad and more of the miniatures in the army. The big boats turned out well too. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Subscribe to the channel. We appreciate all new subscribers, especially as the channel is new. And we will see you next time on our next Jolly Lark.